Funding for this program is made possible by Burke Nursery and Garden Center in Burke, Virginia. You'll find trees and shrubs, perennials and annuals, water garden supplies, houseplants, and bird and gardening supplies. Burke Nursery also provides landscape, plant diagnostic, and installation services, as well as the October month-long Pumpkin Playground Festival featuring hay rides and much more. For more information, you can check out their website or call 703-323-1188. Welcome to Gardening with Burke Nursery, the show where we help you grow your garden and increase the curb appeal of your yard. I'm your host, Misty Kuceris, the horticulturalist at Burke Nursery and Garden Center. And I'd like to talk about a fun activity this time of year, and that's taking a look at all the seeds that are available and deciding just what you'd like to grow in your garden when spring arrives. And to me, what's more important? This is a fun activity that you can do with your family. Whether you're considering a vegetable garden or a flowering garden, now is the time to begin. So join me today as I show you techniques for starting your seeds indoors. So the first thing that you want to know is what zone that you're living in. And zone is the USDA equivalent of telling you what you can expect for temperatures. And the reason that you want to know what zone that you're living in is that then you know when the last spring frost date is. And so here in Northern Virginia, we live in zone 7A, which means that usually our last frost for the spring months occurs around tax day, which is April 15th. Now, sometimes we do get frost as late as Mother's Day here, and Mother's Day is usually the second Sunday of the month of May. So for that reason, I recommend that with the herb basil, that you don't put out your basil until actually after May. But the other herbs or the other spices or the other flowering plants, they can come out around tax day. So keep that in mind. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to give you some ideas of when are some start dates for some of the veggies. I never have the list totally memorized, so I like to have a little cheat sheet here. So if you're going to start seed for cabbage to plant outside, you usually want to do your cabbage about 6 weeks before the first frost date, so 6 weeks before April 15th. And then the others is that you have your cucumbers, and these are usually about 5 weeks before you want to bring them outside. The other, of course, is the eggplant, and the eggplant, believe it or not, you only need to start the seeds inside for 2 weeks, and then you can start bringing them outside. And kale, that's about 6 weeks. Now, your hot peppers and your sweet peppers have 2 different times. So there's not a general time for peppers. The hot peppers actually need a long time indoors. That's because they come from a very, very warm climate. So you need to start these seeds 8 to 10 weeks before April 15th. Your sweet peppers, those you can start a little later. You can start those at 6 to 8 weeks. And then your squash, and squash can be your yellow squash, it can be your zucchini squash, and that is, again, like eggplant, that's only about 2 weeks, so that's not bad. And tomatoes varies. Some tomatoes you need to start 4 to 5 weeks inside. Some you need to start longer, 6 to 8 weeks. And what I found is that my heirloom tomatoes, like your Brandywine tomatoes or the Cherokee tomatoes, those are the ones that usually need to be started inside about 6 to 8 weeks. But then we have actually my favorite tomato, which is the yellow pear tomato. This is really my favorite. And so sometimes I start seeds inside because in this case, as much as I like my little yellow pear tomatoes, I just can't find the plants at any nursery or any other store that sells what we call transplants. The other thing too is that you don't need to really have all these dates memorized. But before I talk about where you can find this without having to look up on the internet or look at various almanacs, let me also just tell you a few of my flowering seeds and the favorite dates for those. So a lot of people now like to plant bee balm because bee balm is a phenomenal pollinator. It is just great. And this takes 6 to 8 weeks. And then your blanket flower, Gaillardia, this is 4 to 6 weeks. And then we also have the Coreopsis. And you'll see that I actually have sprouted some Coreopsis because I like Coreopsis, also known as tick seed. That's about 6 weeks. And a fun annual. Now, the Coreopsis, the bee balm, and the blanket flower, those are all perennials. But a fun annual to sow and start seeds inside to bring them outside is your 4 o'clocks. And there's a reason they're called 4 o'clocks. They're called 4 o'clocks because they bloom, they flower around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So sometimes you walk by and don't see a flower on them, and then you come back and there's that gorgeous flower. And then, of course, your violas. And the violas actually take a long time to seed indoors. That is 8 to 10 weeks to seed indoors. But once you get them established in your garden, they reseed every year, which is phenomenal. So getting back to my favorite, which is the yellow pear tomato. If you don't want to remember when to do all of these, what you can do is take a look at the back of the packet. And you will see several things that are important on the back of the packet. First is the seed depth. So one of the rules of thumb is the teenier the seed, the higher you plant it. You barely push it into the soil. And the 2 feet, what I like to do, and you'll see when I show you some of the seeds that have sprouted, you can't always, when the seeds are so tiny, you can't always space them 2 feet apart. So you space them in the planter the way you want, and then you pull out the ones that you don't want. You cull the seeds. I have a picture of this, but it says right under planting, start seeds indoors 4 to 5 weeks before your first spring frost. So if you don't know and you don't have a list with you, then what you can do is just read the back of the seed packet, and that will tell you the best time to start the seeds. So I've spoken about the different types of seeds that you get, whether you go out and actually get my favorite, which is the yellow pear tomato, or you can go out and get some flowering plants that you may want to plant in your garden. But when you start seeds, it's not that difficult as far as what you need. Seeds, obviously, and then you need containers. And there are different types of containers. So I have some here. These containers here are Peat Pot Containers. They come in 2 different sizes. I personally prefer the 3-inch pot size to the 2-inch pot size, unless I'm doing something that has extremely small seeds like marjoram. But even basil will be fine, but why I prefer these is that I can plant in more seeds here, and then I can separate them when they need to be separated. So that's one thing that you can do. Another type of container are these plastic containers. And these plastic containers have holes on them. Oh, and what I didn't mention, what I like about the peat pots is that once you're ready to plant your seeds outside in the garden, you plant this entire pot, because this just disintegrates right into the garden. Where with something like this, which is a plastic, then you need to take the whole little seed out of here when you're ready. Another is this little mini terrarium, and it comes with pellets, where with these pots, you'll need to fill them with a potting mix that is primarily peat, may have a little vermiculite in it sometimes, but here you have these little pellets, and these pellets are also peat. And this is the fun thing about the pellets. What you do is, if you fill the pellets with water, just put them with water, and we're going to put this aside because you start out, and people have asked me this. They go, that pellet's so small, how do you get a seed in there? Well, you fill it with water and then wait a little bit, so we'll come back to that. And then the other is you can take an egg crate and use an egg crate if you want. So there are different types of containers, and then they also have these containers that are very, very large, and I'll be showing you one of those as well. And then, of course, you either need a container with your little peat pots, or that's one soil medium, or the other, as I said, is the other soil here. And be sure when you go out and purchase it that it says for seed starting. And if you don't find that, actually a bag of peat moss will also do the trick. Then some people like to get a heating pad. This one is what we call a windowsill heating pad. Everything's black down here, so I'll hold this up. And you just plug it in to a standard outlet. And what this does is when you have it down and you have your little container on this, it raises the heat in the container by about 10 to 20 degrees. The other thing that is good about these types of containers, just put that water in the container, is that these containers form a terrarium. And so this terrarium is important because this terrarium, here is one that I actually have going with a few little seeds that I put in here, a few little chive seeds. And you can see how there's all this water just collecting with this. And then some people prefer grow lights, and other people prefer to put these in the southern window to let them sprout. So the first thing that you need to do is decide on your container. And I am going to let that peat pot grow, but if you're going to use this particular peat pot, then what you want to do is that you want to do this dry soil. So let's talk about the peat pot and talk about using the peat pot. If you're going to use the peat pot, my recommendation is not to water this soil first. But if you're going to use a plastic pot, then what you want to do is you want to water that soil because it's easier for control. And so move this out of the way. We don't need the heating pad. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to take your little peat pot, just put a little of this soil in the peat pot. And you do not want to fill the peat pot all the way to the top. You actually want to leave enough here so that the soil will grow. Why? Because one of the things that I didn't talk about is plastic wrap. And after you put the little seeds in here and get this moist, you're going to cover it with plastic wrap. And the purpose is you're creating a little terrarium, and that way that helps with the watering. Then what you do is you take your seeds, and I'm, of course, going to go with my favorite, Now, I'm going to have to take these gloves off because it's harder to open this. So you open the container, and look how tiny these little seeds are. So when you read the label and said put them 2 to 4 feet, sometimes when they're that tiny, it's harder to put in the right amount. And you're going to look at me and say, okay, you're putting this in the dry soil. So that's the dry soil right there. And then I'm just barely putting them into the ground, or in this case, in the soil. Now this is where what you do with the peat pot. You take some sort of container, fill this with water, and then just let it sit in the water, and it'll sit in the water for a while. And what you will find is that by sitting in the water, the base becomes wet like this. And what that does is that water will saturate and it'll actually water the soil. Now, if you wanted to use the plastic, then that is where you wet the soil beforehand and just get it moist, and then put that in here. And as you can see, now I have the moist soil. And again, just top it. And what I will do then is, through the magic of television, show you what happens when you've taken time and have planted this and 2 to 3 weeks have gone by. Now, through the magic of television, let me bring up some of the plants that I seeded about 2-3 weeks ago. And unfortunately, my little pellet here is needing more time to grow. But this is what it grows like when it finally grows, so that way I will have a little seedling. Oh, and this is a cotyledon. If you look right here, you'll see a little black spot on the top of this. And that is actually what's left from the seed covering. So that's not anything that you need to worry about with your seeds. But look at how much the little pod has grown. And what you do once the pod has grown to the right size to plant, you actually take this little wrapping, and then you will put the seed right in the middle of here to plant this. So Here's another one. And these are my little chives coming up. So it'll be here for about 2 to 3 more weeks. And then the other that I'd like to show you, and I forgot that was full of water. Let me move these things off. So many fun toys when you're doing seeds. And don't forget, I think I mentioned this, but egg crates are wonderful. And then this here, this technically was called the Gestation Station because this came not only with its covering, but it also came with a heating pad. So this was under a heating pad. And look at all the humidity again that I have on this. And that's just coming up from the plants. And it's created its own ecosystem so that it moists the soil. This I did not have to water at all. And that's the key, because one of the ways that little seedlings get killed is too much watering. I did, however, plant different types of seeds here, and so they grew too quickly within a couple days. So my recommendation, if you use a tray that's this large, is to make sure you have all the seeds. And if you look here, you will see my little basil leaves coming up. And again, because the seeds were so tiny, it was difficult determining which ones, as far as how many. So now what I'm going to do with these basil plants is I'm going to do what I call culling. And culling means I'm going to take, as I did here and here and here, I'm going to take out the extra seeds, and that one way is to just pull them. And it's amazing, the root system. So you just pull out the ones that look weaker. So definitely survival of the fittest here. And again, in this one, just pull. And again, just leave a couple. And so you want to do that. And that's where it works with a tray that is its own little container, its own little greenhouse. And let me show you my plants. These plants that were in here are Coreopsis plants. And again, you have the little brown seed head on this plant, so not to worry. Now, the one thing, when you're working with plastic and you have either the plastic, when you're working with plastic trays or plastic pots, and you have the plastic wrap over the pots, or you have this covering, then that actually will stay as a terrarium and have its own climate. But when you're working with the peat pots, they dry out very quickly, and especially if you have them under a grow light. So what I would do every 2 or 3 days is I would take my little container and I would take my peat pot and I would put it in here to make sure that the soil was maintaining its moisture. And that's very important. And then the same thing, this is time now also for these. There are way too many Coreopsis seedlings in here. So again, you want to cull the seeds. And that means just trying to see 2 things in this case, which one looks like it's the strongest, and then how centered is it. And sometimes the strongest isn't necessarily the tallest. So this one is the tallest, but it's not really the strongest, so I just remove that. And there are some people who, rather than pluck them out with their hands, prefer to actually take a pair of scissors, which I thought I had here, but it doesn't matter, and they will actually cut them out with the scissors. So again, just pulling the ones that to me look the strongest until I have one, maybe two. And finally, this is the point when they start growing like this that you now need to fertilize them. And so to fertilize them, you would use either a 10-10-10 fertilizer at half the dosage, or you would use a 10-15-10 fertilizer at half the dosage of what the label says. Growing a garden is a lot of fun, and starting your seeds indoors is a great way to prepare for the spring, and it's a great activity for you and your family. I'm your host, Misty Kuceris, and I'd like to thank you for spending your time with me here at Gardening with Burke Nursery. I'm looking forward to helping you grow your garden. Funding for this program is made possible by Burke Nursery and Garden Center in Burke, Virginia. You'll find trees and shrubs, perennials and annuals, water garden supplies, houseplants, and bird and gardening supplies. Burke Nursery also provides landscape, plant diagnostic, and installation services, as well as the October month-long Pumpkin Playground Festival featuring hay rides and much more. For more information, you can check out their website or call 703-323-1188.